Hello, and welcome to the webinar on the 2020 DevTestOps Landscape Survey, Unbreaking QA and DevOps Transformation. I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SC Times. Before we get started, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand on the sctimes.com website in about 24 hours after the event. Secondly, we will be conducting a live Q&A, so if you have any questions about the presentation, you may submit them at any time using the Control Panel's Questions tab. Here at SC Times, we see how DevOps has transformed the way businesses think and software teams work. But the power of DevOps has been limited because there's been a lack of quality assurance as a core capability. QA testing can no longer be an afterthought. It needs to be in every phase of the application development lifecycle. Today's webinar will look at how to put automated testing at the center of DevOps and go over the idea of DevTestOps. So here to talk about this further, we have John Purcell, head of product at the intelligent test automation company Mabel. So now to get things started, I'm going to throw it over to you, John.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks for the warm intro, and hi to everybody that's joined the session today. I'd like to welcome you and really say thanks for joining us wherever you're connecting from. I hope you're all well, safe, and healthy given what's going on around us. So let's jump in and set the stage right off the top. So as more and more teams adopt things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, application testing has become really a growing concern, as Christina alluded to in the opening. Now, software dev teams tell us that they struggle to keep up with the amount and frequency of tests needed, ultimately affecting their ability to ship quality code at the speed they're looking for. Now, nevertheless, companies that are deliberately breeding a culture of quality across and throughout the organization, we find they're integrating testing into the dev workflow itself. And over the course of the session today, we'll share some data with you from a study that we concluded earlier this year that really underlines these points. So let's start by reviewing some of the core tenets of the environment that we're operating in. Now, there's an undeniable truth, we would argue, in software today, that everyone wants to deliver new features quickly and fix issues faster and faster. And there are new development processes, tools, and frameworks, and these have certainly made development cycles work quickly, but it doesn't always leave enough time to test software. Now, this graphic gives us a sense of the asymmetry involved and that I'm sure you all see in your own environments. Development is happening at a rapid pace, as we sort of are alluding to, and it feels like there is a global objective to accelerate even further, week after week, month after month, quarter after quarter, year after year. Acceleration seems to be what we're all chasing. But the problem here is that the testing function has tended to slow down releases. In the past, simply put, it takes time to properly test code. And that's especially true when you're employing, traditional techniques. DevOps, I think you'll all agree, has already disrupted the world of software development and deployment. And the good news is that this movement is also now disrupting the world of software testing. Before DevOps or pre-DevOps, change was infrequent. We had weeks, sometimes months to write tests, and we oftentimes had weeks to execute them. But today with DevOps, change is constant. Right? We only have quite often hours to write tests and sometimes just minutes to execute them. Now, I doubt this will sort of create much controversy in some of the assertions we've made so far, but let's specifically talk about the survey we conducted this year and take a look at the data that it generated. Now, we ran this survey over the course of Q4 last year and into Q1 this year. We closed it in March 2020. We received over 1,000 responses from people all over the world. And from a roles point of view, almost 60% of the respondents were in a focused testing role, and 34% were software developers, self-characterized as software developers. With respect to firmographics, we saw 32% of respondents work in enterprise companies. And so we think we had a good cross-section of the market from which to draw from. So what did these people tell us? Well, in the remaining material I'll walk through today, we're going to look at overall trends in the continuous world, and we'll take a look at both customer experience and developer experience. So let's start with some foundational trends in adoption. So we disaggregated the continuous world into three sections, as you can see on this slide: integration, delivery, and deployment. And we generated data on each one separately. Now, this slide shows you how the responses have changed between 2019, when we last ran the survey, and 2020. And the first thing to note here from the left two charts is that continuous integration and delivery have both increased in adoption. So from the gray bars to the orange bars. However, the right-hand chart tells us that continuous deployment seems to have flattened out and is generally less adopted. So why is this? Well, like most things, we think it could be a variety of factors. Perhaps tooling is less developed in that area, or maybe it's a measure of how risk-averse companies are when it comes to actually pushing finally to production. Could it be that the concept of fail fast is losing its appeal? We've certainly learned from companies like Facebook over the last couple of years that even if you can roll back an issue quickly, it can still have a lasting and detrimental impact on your customers and your brand once your code hits production if it has significant issues. Next, we looked at deployment frequency, and we looked at it year over year. Now, immediately, what we notice here is that deployments are becoming more rapid overall. We see an overall drop in yearly, quarterly, and monthly deployments to the left of the chart, and a growth in the boxed off area in bi-weekly to daily deployments. In fact, as you can see, the greatest year-over-year change is in the number of companies now deploying daily. As you can see, it's a 9% to 14% jump. We think that's pretty notable. The next thing we did was we asked respondents to identify themselves in one of four categories related to how they build and deploy software. And you can see these categories along the x-axis in this chart, from those that self-characterize as being still waterfall all the way to sort of fully embracing and fully adopting DevOps practices or operations. Now, not surprisingly, the DevOps teams represented in the rightmost data set in the chart in front of you had a massive lead in shipping multiple times per day. 21% of that cohort said they pushed to production that often, while teams that self-identified as solidly waterfall to the left of the slide mostly ship on a monthly basis or less frequently. Now, we'd probably expect to see this. It's certainly what you hear most about at conferences and events and in every blog on the subject. Shipping one or more times per day has felt a bit like a prime directive for several years now, if you work in the software industry. I know I've spent a good chunk of the last 10 years aiming for that sort of operation and that sort of frequency. When we looked at this data, though, we found it interesting to look at the population that ships weekly. Even teams that are closer to waterfall are managing to ship weekly. 22% of those who responded in the waterfall category said they ship weekly. And as you move to the right here, in other words, you become more DevOps centric, weekly deployments certainly do grow in significance. Even teams that see themselves as having achieved DevOps nirvana are still shipping weekly at quite a rate. 23% of those respondents said that they typically ship on a weekly basis. So, we think that this perhaps reinforces the earlier point about continuous deployment and some of the risk assessment and risk tolerance for companies, in that regard. So, quick review in this section. Deployment frequencies are growing year over year, as we saw, and especially among those who ship daily, as you'll recall, that's where we saw the greatest increase from 2019 to 2020. So let's kick on now and take a look at how we test. And specifically, let's look for correlations in the data with customer experience. So we provided in our survey 10 different options for the types of tests that could be automated in the CI/CD pipeline. Now, you, like us, probably won't be surprised to see unit integration and API tests up in the 30 to 40% range in terms of automation. But we also see functional and system testing are up in that range also. Now, traditionally, you can see the tests that are harder to stand up and reliably automate in the CI/CD context. Now, to make this comparison more explicit, we can see in this chart that those types of tests are much more likely to be done manually. And interestingly, there is a tipping point in the data, as you can see here, where we see more people executing these tests manually rather than leveraging a pipeline to automate them or otherwise automating them. And in every test, every type of testing to the right of functional in this chart, this pattern and this trend seems to hold true. So we can draw a line under this point and really emphasize it. We saw a lot of automation in the earlier development lifecycle tests, unit integration and API, as I mentioned, but not many or very few automated further down the pipeline in terms of system performance and so forth. Now, many teams that we talk to as part of our business already understand the importance of automating tests, further down the pipeline. However, they do face challenges that seem to leave them, or traditionally have left them, stranded in their efforts to really realize and make that a reality, make that operation a reality. And David Sharp at MemberClicks has a very clear vision, as many do, for the world he wants to create for his teams, and we're working closely with him to realize that vision. Now, we already know and understand some of the key challenges in implementing automated testing in an end-to-end context. It's really a combination of technology and tools, skill sets, and yes, even team culture in certain cases. Automation can sometimes feel like a slog or a journey, and you hit barriers and you hit friction along the way. But there is a vision that many companies now have in mind, and they're striving to get there as quickly as they can. So I mentioned at the beginning of this section that we were looking for correlations with customer experience, satisfaction, happiness, that sort of thing. So we asked people to report, based on the customer feedback they get, where their customer experience falls, from terrible, our customers only stay because they have nowhere else to go, all the way up to it's amazing, our customers love our product, and all open issues, are nice to haves. Now, as you can see in the bottom bar of this chart, respondents with amazing customer happiness levels reported a higher number of automated tests in their pipeline. And the top bar shows the inverse case. Those with terrible customer happiness levels automated significantly fewer tests. And what's more, there's generally a linear progression in the percentage of automated tests from one end of this customer experience scale to the other. And when you're assessing correlation, this is exactly what you're looking for. So we're concluding here that amazing customer experience or customer happiness really does depend on how much you're testing and how much of that testing is ongoing and automated. So I think we appreciate the inherent and almost universal benefit that automation brings with it. I'm sure there wouldn't be much debate about the value of automation. But what this data shows in this report, it shows us that automation clearly impacts that customer experience. There's a direct correlation and a strong correlation between those two areas of concern. So now let's talk about something that's just as important as customer experience, and that's developer experience. And just to be clear, in this context, when we say developer experience, we're referring to the entire software team, QA, operations, PMs, and so forth. Now, DevOps and DevOps teams are clearly leaders in automation. And as we saw earlier, we talked about the adoption of continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment over time. Well, what this chart does is it looks at those results through a team prism. So let's pause here for just a couple of moments and let's look at some of the key data points on this chart. So what it's telling us is 91% of fully DevOps teams have adopted or are transitioning to continuous integration operations. If you look at this chart at the very top, versus only 34% of, 49% of waterfall teams. Again, in the DevOps world, there's little to no debate about continuous adoption, and many teams that are fully DevOps are already there. They've already moved on to the next set of problems. What the middle chart tells us is that 88% of DevOps teams have adopted or are transitioning to continuous delivery versus 34% of waterfall teams. And again, it's not surprising to see the distinction or disparity between DevOps teams and waterfall teams in the context of continuous motion, continuous operations. Interestingly, however, as this was sort of hinted in our earlier slide, when you think about continuous deployment, only 43% of DevOps teams have actually fully adopted continuous deployment. And 26% of those teams are transitioning or are on a path, 29% are on a path to adopting. 34% again of waterfall teams said they have adopted it or are transitioning. Now, this probably confirms in data what many of you and certainly we believe to be true. The very definition of DevOps should include, and in many cases does include, automation and continuous concepts. And we think this data, we're already seeing this data, in fact, is convincing other companies to really start their journey or accelerate their journey to full continuous adoption and to, working in a DevOps sort of context. Now, one of the most profound impacts of automation in that DevOps world is in how quickly you can correct mistakes. Now, let's be honest, we're all in software, I assume. We know that mistakes happen often, and many would argue that when mistakes happen, it just proves that we're taking risks and we're making progress, and we're trying to innovate and deliver value to our customers. Given that, though, if you want to ship fast, we'd argue you really ought to be able to, Control Z your releases, right, or undo or roll back your releases, effectively. Now, what this data shows us on this slide is that DevOps teams are significantly better at rolling back releases fast, right? And that's the important qualifier here: speed. With a 30% lead in DevOps respondents being able to roll back releases in less than an hour. That's an important, speed is the important factor here. Now, that ability to roll back quickly goes hand in hand with production monitoring. That's an activity that we'll come back to a little later in the presentation. So keep that in mind. Okay, so how do these processes actually affect developer experience, which is the point of the section we're talking about here? So we asked how much stress respondents felt on release day, from a great deal, as represented in the orange bars, to not at all, represented in the green bars, with a lot, moderate, or a little, on the spectrum from a great deal to not at all. Now, about half of the DevOps respondents felt little to no stress on release day, as you can see in the bottom row of this particular chart. And we think this makes sense. If you're shipping more often, then each release is likely, smaller in size or smaller in scope. But when you have the orchestration in place to handle the delivery and quick rollback if necessary, then this also reduces stress. Now, if you look at this from a slightly different perspective and examine or take a look at confidence, we asked how confident respondents felt about their releases, from we're just closing our eyes and hoping for the best in the orange bars to we're totally confident. We have robust monitoring systems in place and we do testing really well in green. And the DevOps teams in the bottom row of this particular chart show that they feel significantly more confident in their work. 55% of the respondents said, no problem, totally confident. Now, in addition to wanting to help companies on their journey to DevOps and therefore confidence, one of the most relevant numbers in this particular data set to Mabel is the 42% of DevOps respondents that said they wish they had more time to test. And this is precisely why we formed our company. So we ripped through 4 different data sets rather quickly in this particular section. So let's do a quick review. We clearly saw that the DevOps culture and processes improve stress and confidence levels. So they reduce stress, to be clear, and increase confidence in what's being deployed and our ability to roll back. And we know that DevOps encompasses many, many different things and has many, many different sort of variations on the definition. And a transformation to a DevOps type operation can take years. But hopefully this helps narrow down or really helps you prioritize what to put first when you're making those decisions, when making the transformation or the transition at your organization. And speaking of transformation, let's take a look at the final pieces of data that we chose to lift out of the report for today. We briefly talked about production monitoring a little earlier. I mentioned it in passing and I said we'd come back to it. Now, it's important to make quality a whole team responsibility. And a big win here is to just know what's going on in production. In other words, how are customers using the product? Are there, rage clicks happening in any area of the application? Are people abandoning the product? How deep is our engagement? What kind of active usage are we seeing across the application? Are there problems, delays, latency? All of the types of experiences that can produce a negative response across our customer base or our user base. And there are several. Well, there are more than several. There are really quite a few production tools out there to help you monitor your applications once they've been pushed and as they're updated. And so rather than pick one or two or focus on a specific tool, we kept the question relatively high level. And we simply asked, how proficient are you with your team's monitoring tools? And as you can see in the data on this particular chart, the answers ranged from not proficient at all to I'm okay, I can work with some basic queries, all the way to sure, I'm proficient, I know what I'm doing, I know how to use this, and I can derive insights from what the tools are telling me. Now, when you look at this by role type, whether it's manager, developer, anybody sort of associated, in a focused quality role, or anybody that really would sort of be traditionally considered an ops type professional, operations, SRE, platform engineer, and so forth. It's a mixed story. You have a variety of different exposure levels and comfort levels with production monitoring tools. But if you look at this data set, again, through the lens of customer experience, what you see is a really more interesting and relevant pattern. And we noticed a strong correlation again, between respondents with amazing customer happiness levels or customer experience levels and a high number of roles that were leveraging their team's monitoring tools, at least to some degree. So just to expand on this point a bit, for respondents with amazing customer experience, as represented in the chart to the left, we see management and testers engaged with the monitoring tools. And these are certainly roles that would be more intimate with the customer journeys and the business goals of the applications. And so when you have a broader set of people who are at least accessing and engaged with the monitoring tools, we see a correlation with an amazing customer experience, or a very strong and positive customer experience. On the other hand, and this is a stark contrast, when you look at the chart to the right, you can see that respondents who believe they have terrible customer experience or happiness levels had very few team members involved in the team's monitoring tools. And even roles that you would anticipate would live in the context of monitoring, let's say traditionally, ops, operations, even those, fully 2/3 of those respondents said they really are not proficient at all with the monitoring tools. And you can see that that story just becomes more and more sort of extreme as you look at the other roles. Developers and across the cohort that responded to the survey, fully 100% of them said they're not proficient at all in these monitoring tools. So this is a pretty stark and I think effective side-by-side view, and really sort of, I think, nails the correlation between customer experience, which is what we're all after, and what is the lifeblood of most of our businesses, and how widely and how thoroughly the people in our software development lifecycle are aware and are engaged with monitoring for that. And so we also think that the very same argument is relevant in the context of software testing. In other words, testing and software quality should also be a team sport, so to speak. And I think this is really the impetus behind the shift left movement that you're probably all familiar with, and certainly, we read a lot about, and really Mabel lives sort of at the epicenter of. I think, just to put this quite simply, what we're arguing is testing needs to be owned by more than QA, and that's an argument that I think has persisted for a number of years now. Testing needs to be owned by more than QA. Now, in the traditional model, the reason we make this argument is that in the traditional model, the bulk of software testing was done by QA specialists, and was also done in later in the software delivery lifecycle. So either in a QA environment, in a staging or other pre-prod environment, or ultimately in some extreme cases, in production, in the most sort of, I would think, sort of least well put together sort of life cycles. And so, again, traditional model, you test late, and it's done by testing specialists, or what we would have traditionally considered to be a QA professional. Now, the shift left model, what it really argues is that we ought to be spending more time testing up front, or testing earlier, to find issues or bugs. And of course, if you've spent any sort of time in the world of testing or quality assurance, you'll know that the earlier you can find issues in your software, the more time you save, the more money you save. It's just cheaper to find and fix issues earlier in the cycle. And so, there's a nuance here as it pertains to shift left. You'll sometimes hear arguments in the industry that says, well, shift left means developers now have to test software. And we would say, sure, if it makes sense in your organization that the testing obligation is now shared or owned by the professionals actually writing the code and writing the software, sure. If you have tools and frameworks and mechanisms to do that effectively and quickly, then yeah, we would absolutely support that, and we have tools to help there. But fundamentally, what we're arguing is that shift left simply means testing earlier in the cycle. And if you look at this particular chart, you see this interesting crossover point that we've sort of labeled master, right? If you think about the point at which software is merged to master, if you're in the software development, world, or you're inside the machine room, the merging to master, typically testing has been done after that point. You could, in your mind, visualize that as sort of like a demarcation zone, and the more testing and the more complete testing, end-to-end testing, the more comprehensively we can test before that point. In other words, before we're merging this our code to master, what we find is that the more cost-effective it can be, and the more you can reliably increase the quality of what's ultimately going to ship or deploy, to production. So, to meet the requirements of DevOps teams, as we've been talking about today, we're arguing we must shift this testing left, shift it earlier, test often, test collaboratively. In other words, the more we can, the more we can expose our software to the same kinds of testing, or testing can be defined in one area but executed in another in terms of the life cycle. I think this is what testing collaboratively means when we think about it. And of course, you get bonus points when you automate it. And in many cases, in order to do this in an effective and efficient manner from a time point of view, you have to be able to test quickly and make it seamless, integrate it to your pipeline, automate it wherever possible, and really the nirvana in that respect, we think, is to be able to, run a full suite of regression tests for every PR. That would be a wonderful place to be, and we can catch issues before they start. Make test output part of the code review process. Make it part of the PR review process. Automation quite often is a key way to achieve that. Okay, so let's put this all together. And thanks for your patience as we've sort of walked through this. I appreciate that we kind of ran through a lot of this data quite quickly. But let's review what we've talked about. Key differentiators of DevOps, right? Again, confirmed in data from the survey. A rapid release frequency, right? We saw earlier that DevOps teams are, they're aiming for once a day, multiple times per day. But for the more risk-averse companies, we're seeing a weekly cadence, feeling like a sort of a good frequency. But the more frequently we can push, this seems to be the primary driver of DevOps, and it's not that surprising. But that's what differentiates DevOps from the alternatives, or where we used to be, let's say. Secondly, differentiation. Fully automated CI and CD pipelines. Now, we disaggregated, as we talked about, integration from delivery, from deployment. I think the data showed us that the adoption of, continuous integration and continuous delivery, activities and tasks, I think is almost, I would say, pretty mature at this point, and we're well along the path towards nailing that, and automation is a key component of that. Work remains, though, frankly, on the continuous deployment side of it. We've got to walk that line between high confidence in what we're deploying to production and speed, right? That there's always that sort of delicate dance and delicate trade-off that we have to, keep in mind. And then the third sort of key point in the DevOps world, as we saw in the data, is that, it gives you, and you have to then lean into the ability to promote and demote releases quickly. And again, looked at through a DevOps lens, for teams that describe themselves as fully DevOps, over 70% of them said they were able to roll back a release in less than an hour. And that, of course, I think we touched on this. It does suggest when you're releasing that frequently that your deployment chunks or your deployment scopes are a little smaller, maybe a lot smaller in certain cases. And so that makes rollback a little bit more tenable. Nevertheless, the concept and the practice is what we're really trying to nail here. And even if even if you're releasing weekly, giving yourself the ability to roll back very, very quickly, sub an hour, sub 2 hours, that's really what we're talking about. You've got to be able to, if you find an issue in production, get it out of production or solve it there as quickly as you possibly can. And DevOps, with all of the automation and process that goes along with that, I think has really disrupted the world of software development, and we're seeing the same thing happen in the world of test. Now, I will stress that you have to find the cadence of release that works for you and for your customers. But know that when you get it right, when you get that cadence right, it has a very real impact on the experience that those customers have, right? And we showed how increasing the level of automation, the data showed, frankly, to be clear, how increasing the level of automation and then distributing the testing obligation across doing it collaboratively, distributing it and shifting it left in the life cycle, both have a clear impact on customer experience. Think back to how we saw the difference between companies that have an amazing customer experience, or whose customers have an amazing experience, versus those who, let's face it, describe it themselves, their customers having a terrible experience. And we, I think, very clearly showed how automation and then that distribution, and making it a team sport is really tightly correlated. And then finally, DevOps practices we saw had a big impact, a real significant, I think, marked impact on developer experience by giving those teams, software delivery teams, more confidence in their releases and reducing the stress, on release day, right? And I think we could probably connect and surmise the kinds of things that contribute to that and sort of ease stress levels, the knowledge that the scope of the change is small, that the ability to roll back is high, and the ability to do it quickly and fast and smoothly is also high. And I think there's a certain that changes your risk tolerance, alongside that. And so we saw that developer experience, and the argument, I'll remind everybody that we see developer experience just as critical in what we're trying to do in our business as customer experience. And so these are sort of like the three key items that we picked out of the data in the report, a report that I think you'll all get a copy of, after today's session. But these were the three key findings, or three key areas of analysis that we chose to focus on today. And so just a quick word on Mabel before we get to questions. And so if you've never heard of Mabel, Mabel is an intelligent test automation platform really for your whole team, right? It's built for a continuous pipeline, so CI/CD, and it tightly integrates automated end-to-end testing into the entire development lifecycle. You can, and how does it do it, and how do we achieve that? Well, for starters, you can very, very easily create reliable and automatable or automated UI tests that are really very easy to maintain, right? We hear a lot of concern in the industry about the flakiness of tests, especially at the UI layer. So something small changes in the UI layer, or changes frequently, the traditional way or the old style way of creating tests, the tests would be brittle and break. So with Mabel, we've really tackled that problem head on, and that's where the concept of intelligence, comes into the discussion. We really have built in the ability to detect those changes much more, innately or automatically. We can self-heal or repair the test. We can simply update the test when we find an element has changed position, but otherwise hasn't really changed in content. And so they're very, very easy to create those tests and very easy to maintain, at the same time. Now, it's a unified platform. And so what do we mean by that? It means that really everyone on your team can contribute to testing, right? You don't necessarily need to be what we might call a traditional professional tester, right? But with everybody on the same platform, what we found is that you really can increase test coverage across multiple applications and throughout the lifecycle. Comprehensive test results, right? The way you sort of consume, okay, I've been running tests continuously, I've been running them on an automated basis. How easy is it for me to go in and diagnose, something's happened, something's gone wrong in a test has failed, I've received an alert. How do I sort of really get in and understand what's gone wrong? Well, so we focused a lot on the user experience around the way you consume test results so that you can really find, let's say, actionable insights, right? That's really what we're trying to deliver through our reporting, and you can deliver those insights across the entire development lifecycle, right? So if a test, for example, has slowed down, let's say, over repeated runs, we can suggest that perhaps you have a performance regression on a page or in a certain area of the application, and we can deliver that to you as an insight. So a lot of companies are in addition to functional testing, or does the page perform as it's supposed to? When I click a button, does it do what I'm supposed to do? We can also give you feedback and insights into how performant it is, and is your performance increasing or decreasing over time. And then, at the end of the day, what this is really all about is creating what we call customer-centric end-to-end tests. And really what we're after here is developing tests that effectively assess and measure the experience your customers are going to have in using your application. It's fine that we sort of pass unit tests, we pass functional tests, we pass feature tests, maybe we're doing a little bit of integration testing. But at the end of the day, what we really want to understand, I think, is what impact are all of the changes that, remember, in a DevOps sort of in a fast release, fast deploy type of environment, this change is constant, change is continuous. So what we're really trying to do is really gain an insight and understand what impact that rate of change and what we're actually changing is having on the customer's experience. And so developing a set of tests that are comprehensive and can reliably synthesize exactly what a customer is going to experience is to us gives you a remarkable insight, and being able to deliver that insight earlier and earlier in the pipeline is really at the core of Mabel's mission. So, we've finished here with a little bit of time left on the clock. So I wanted to say thanks for sort of following along. Thanks for engaging in the content, and hopefully the data was revealed some insights and maybe gave you a sort of a fresh perspective on the world of DevOps, test automation in general, and the correlation with customer and developer experience. And the report that you'll see after the session today goes into more detail on the areas we covered today, but also on an additional set of areas that that we were able to generate some pretty interesting data sets around. So I'll pause there, and if you have any questions from the audience, I'd be happy to try and take a stab at those.
Great, thanks for a great presentation, John. If our listeners have any questions, they can submit them now. While we're waiting, I'll sort of kick things off. In the beginning of the presentation, we saw that increased adoption with continuous integration and continuous delivery, not as high with continuous deployment, but do you see the adoption of continuous delivery and continuous deployment continuing to grow over the next 3 to 5 years?
Good question, Christina. Thanks. Yeah, yes. I think the short answer is yes. I think these trends, even though the trends in continuous integration and delivery, I think, are pretty clear. And when we looked at it through a team lens, I think it was pretty obvious that teams that are fully DevOps, I think, are already there, and there's almost ubiquitous and full adoption there. The interesting one, so yes, for integration and delivery, we absolutely expect to see that trend growing. And there are probably two things that I would find a little bit more interesting to dig into, and that's for companies that are not there yet, at what rate will we see that adoption go up over the next 12, 24, 36 months and beyond? I think that's probably a really key metric to understand as it pertains to just how the industry overall is transforming, and whether that sort of, in marketing terms, if the late arriving majority to DevOps, or when tooling is sufficient and when companies feel confident enough, I think that'll impact the rate of growth, over time. The second, the second key thing I think would be interesting to track is this notion of continuous deployment, and we saw lower adoption rates in the continuous deployment practices. We saw lower growth from 2019 to 2020, and we saw lower completed adoption when we looked at it through a team lens, if you recall. And we're wondering if this is a question of risk tolerance, and even for companies that are executing very, very rapidly, and code is, software is making its way through the pipeline, quickly, at the adopting continuous deployment where we're pushing to production as quickly. What we're really curious about is whether this evolves as a best practice, right? And what best practice really means in that context. I'm not sure I see it as a milestone or an end goal, right? In terms of the transformation effort that companies are going to go through. But the practices that we think need to be in place to surround and support continuous deployment, whether it's monitoring and observability, whether it's this concept of shift right practices, or involving more of your team members in in an awareness and a tracking of what's happening once code is pushed to production. We think that's pretty important to roll into the goals, as we look at over the next 3 to 5 years, and whether those, whether a greater familiarity there and an adoption of those types of practices in turn drive continuous deployment, I think will be an interesting trend to watch. But those are the two things that I think we'll be watching.
Great. Now, you mentioned developer experience was just as critical as customer experience. How does the survey quantify developer experience as a metric?
Yeah, so well, what we showed was we looked at stress as an indicator, and we looked at confidence as a second indicator, and those were, obviously we were able to report on those, and we showed them in the presentation today. And by the way, that was sort of the scope of the responses in the survey. So the survey itself doesn't necessarily go into any sort of deeper or more scientific approach to measuring, or there's no alternate metric necessarily in there. But what it told us, frankly, was it's a pretty interesting thread to pull there, and it's a pretty interesting lens to look through when you look at process, you look at best practices, you look at technology, you look at concepts like DevOps, automation, monitoring, deployment lifecycle, CI/CD, you name it. I think really understanding the impact that has, and maybe developing a more comprehensive metric in this area is something that we found quite interesting, and I think something we'll probably want to follow up on in subsequent surveys.
Great. Now, do you have any suggestions on how developers can better understand the customer experience and bring that into their development environment?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I think many companies have, they have teams of people who, they have a team or teams of people whose primary job or primary focus or concern is on retention, right? So are we, especially in subscription businesses, right, which most new businesses are either or are trying to become, right? And so retention of your customer is really the most fundamental measure of customer experience, right? Sort of it's an interesting reality when you move into subscription software. You really have to start, you sell your product on day one, but then you're selling it for 364 additional days until they decide whether to renew or not, right? So it's changed the dynamics in many businesses, especially online businesses. So anyway, so companies have these teams that focus on retention or customer experience, and their mission is to measure things like, NPS, Net Promoter Score, or CSAT, or and there are tools that they use to measure those, and they're all sort of indicators of customer health and the likelihood that a customer will stick around and will continue to find your product, useful, or they'll rely on it at some level. It's a great way to get a high-level view, certainly, and I think for developers or for software organizations, right, or the functions within a software team company, the trick is to find ways to try to share that, try to collaborate on that information, try to get exposed to that information somehow, even if it means, I remember at my last company, we would have customer retention experts who would join developer meetings or join sort of engineering team meetings and just sort of give insight into what's going on out in the world of customer retention. Another interesting, just while we're on the subject, another interesting approach here is for organizations that have a UX or a user experience function, and quite often they're housed within the product or the engineering team. These are people who are, what do they do every day? They're constantly interviewing users, and they're researching the way customers interact with and engage with the product, and they're constantly looking for insights that help us better understand the world and our product world from a user's perspective, right, and how they view the product. So you don't even necessarily have to go out to a different function in the company. If you have a UX organization and a good product organization, they're often a great proxy, not a proxy, and so they directly have a deep understanding of what's going on out in the customer realm. So I think there's a way to bring that back into the development and engineering organization and give us a better sense for CX.
Great. I'm gonna combine these next two questions just for time's sake, but
sure.
Can you explain a little bit more on how automating end-to-end tests with the Mabel platform works, and do you guys support security testing?
So there's I'll try to keep this brief in the interest of time. Happy to follow up with anybody that might be interested in digging a bit deeper on that. So Mabel was the first real SaaS testing tool that was built natively for cloud organizations and for companies that are sort of on the way or already embracing DevOps process and DevOps practices. And so in that context, we chose to implement as a SaaS, make our offering SaaS-based, and really because we think it's the only way to effectively deliver that and to automate that throughout the pipeline. And so, we were really focused on combating the specific problem of testing in DevOps and the fact that it was falling behind, right? It was creating this pinch point that I showed you in the graphic, earlier in the presentation. And so, Mabel really allows any team member today, regardless of technical expertise, to create resilient functional UI tests, right? And you can either automate them either via schedule, if you want to run it on a predictable cadence, or you can connect it right into your CI/CD pipeline quite easily, and then you can actually trigger it based on events, right? Pipeline events, deployments, pull requests, that sort of thing. And so the way we achieve that is we have a component in the product we call the Mabel Trainer, and this has traditionally been delivered as a Chrome extension, and you use that to create tests by just interacting and using your applications like your users would, and the trainer will observe, track, capture that interaction, and then transform those into, or translate those into test steps. And then our UI, we focus a tremendous amount on our user experience and try to make our UI as intuitive as possible in that regard. So you can add logic, into those test steps to sort of adjust the journey. So you can essentially, you can adjust or tailor the journey or the test in a variety of different ways. You can assert on content, you can check for the existence of content, you can sort of introduce the concept of variables or dummy data and that sort of thing. You can inject math operation, if that makes sense, in the context of your application. So you can create basic applications very quickly just by having the trainer observe what you're doing with the app, and then you can customize those test steps in a large variety of different ways. So that's with the Mabel Trainer through the Chrome extension. We make it easy for teams to shift left or shift testing left, as we said earlier in the cycle. We've got a handful of developer-friendly workflows, so developers can create feature-based functional tests with Mabel earlier in the pipeline. And then we make it easy for teams to monitor their regression and smoke testing suites with our AI and ML-driven insights. So you can keep an eye on performance trends, as I described, and you can very quickly track and then automatically heal visual changes in the application. So I hope that helps. I tried to keep it sort of quick.
Great. That's all the time we're going to have for questions today. But before we go, John, do you have any key takeaways or any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, greatly appreciate, time is expensive. Everybody's extremely busy. I really appreciate everybody's willingness to spend time with us today and kind of walk through this data. The report that you can see on the screen here will be distributed to everybody that was an attendee. We'll get a copy of this report. So I encourage you to dig through that and sort of, bathe in the data that's in there and the insights that are in there. And we'd love to engage and be happy to talk through that and just sort of, debate and argue and discuss some of the findings in there. And if Mabel as a product is at some level interesting to you, or you struggle with some of these problems and you wonder if Mabel could help, obviously always glad to engage and have a conversation about that. So, but overall, thanks for your time and thanks for hosting, and I really appreciate the opportunity to go through this.
Perfect, and thanks again for a great presentation. Again, that was John Purcell, Head of Product at Mabel, and I'd like to thank Mabel for sponsoring today's event, as well as the attendees for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Christina Cardoza. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.